Billionaire's Contract episode. 8. Melissa's POV. Melissa found herself quite bothered because of the way Nelson Willingston was behaving. He was appearing more appealing to her, and the attraction she felt towards him, only physically though, was worrisome. Not that it was only because she felt so, but the reason was also something else. He was frequently half naked whenever at the mansion. He would come close to her, and without even touching her. He would leave her hot and bothered. She knew she was physically attracted to Nelson Willingston, but she blamed it on the hormones. He was attractive, handsome, every girl's dream, but he was rude, insensitive, and a jerk. And she just prayed and hoped that at the end the results would be positive, because if not, then she will have to comply with his rules. Sarah stepped out of the orphanage when an expensive car stopped in front of her. She frowned and narrowed her eyes to see who it was. The door opened and a man stepped out fixing his blazer. The shades on his face screamed attitude, and she waited for him to either walk in the opposite direction or towards her. Finally, he turned towards her and she immediately recognized him. Philip. He was Nelson Willingston's best friend, and also a famous and successful businessman. He was often seen in pictures with Nelson Willingston, but right now she hated anyone related to Mr. Willingston for what he had done to her best friend. She was sure she could not talk to him without a snide remark. "Excuse me," she heard him call her just when she turned to leave. Huffing in annoyance, she faced him and gave him a glare. "Whoa, that look can kill me." He chuckled on his own line while she gave him a weird look. "What is he?" "By the way, I'm Philip." He smiled and forwarded his hand for a handshake. Sarah looked at his hand, and then at him, but made no movement to take his hand. "Okay, you don't want to shake hands, fair enough. I just came here to give something to the kids." He smiled, looking behind at the orphanage, but Sarah came in between and blocked his view. "We don't accept donations. We don't need anything from you, so please leave." She snarled, glaring at him hard, but seems like it didn't affect him, because he was looking rather amused. "Who said I was giving donation? And is this your orphanage? Because as far as I know, this is Melissa's orphanage, and I'm her brother-in-law." He grinned, whereas Sarah's glare turned into a scowl. "For you to form a relationship with her, first there needs to be relation between my friend and your friend, which clearly is missing. So, stop trying to get in using that tactic." She retorted, and Philip enjoyed her fiery attitude. It amused as well as entertained him seeing such a personality after so long, because he's used to see Nelson's expressionless face and his cold responses. But here was a new character in front of him, and he surely enjoyed her angry face, which supposedly made her look like an angry kitten. Her eyes sharpened, nostrils flared, and mouth pressed in a thin line. In that moment, Philip knew that he was going to visit this orphanage a lot. A week passed, and Melissa got no signs of pregnancy. No morning sickness, no cravings, nothing. She was worried, and there was no denying to it. She would hardly see Nelson these days, and that kinda made her relieved. He had not even once asked about how she was feeling these days. Not that she cared, but she was his responsibility now. It was 7 in the evening when she saw Philip walking in the mansion. She smiled at him, and he grinned back happily. "Hello, Melissa. How are you?" he asked as he sat on the couch before her. "Bored." One word, and he chuckled, looking at her pout. Philip was so sure these two best friends were polar opposite. One was fiery and ready to pounce on her opponent with her claws itching to scratch, while the other was too innocent and naive to even hurt a soul. He actually wondered how weird, yet beautiful, was this best friend relationship, because his also was no less. Let's go out for some adventure before that boring person arrives and bores you even more, he suggested, and she readily agreed, because truth be told, she was dying to get out of this mansion. They got out of there, and only after 10 minutes did Nelson's car arrive at the mansion. He entered inside and his eyes went to the couch, where she always sits. But on finding it empty today, his eyes went to her room. He was early today, so maybe she was inside her room. Dismissing those thoughts, he left for his room. An hour later, when he arrived in the living room, but she was still not there. Her door was also shut. But then he realized that he was thinking too much. He didn't care where she was or how she was, because she was his responsibility only when she would be pregnant with his child. And right now, she definitely was not pregnant. Melissa was surprised when Philip brought her to Hope. She couldn't thank him enough, but he just brushed it off with a smile. So when she stepped inside with Philip beside her, Sarah was irritated to say the least. She was happy that Melissa had come to meet everyone, but what was the need to bring that idiot along? Little did she know that it was him who brought her along. You! What are you doing here? I warned you not to come here still. You don't have any shame, right? Just get out right now. Sarah blasted on Philip and Melissa's eyes widened. She held Sarah's hand and took her in a corner. Sarah was still glaring at Philip, but then Melissa made her look at her. Sarah, what are you doing? Why are you talking to him like that? Melissa hissed. But Sarah had enough seeing her best friend siding with that idiot. You are asking me this? He is that monster's friend, and you are siding with him? Why did you even bring him along? She asked in a pissed-off tone. Firstly, even if he is Mr. Willingstone's friend, you cannot judge him like that. And secondly, I didn't bring him here, but he did. Melissa explained, and Sarah was surprised with that piece of information. She glanced at Philip, who was already smirking at her. She scowled back at him because he was mocking her. Whatever it was, she does not like this man. Melissa saw this exchange between the two and sighed, shaking her head. She had no idea what was going between these two, and she didn't even want to come in between, so she simply decided to leave and meet her kids. Melissa, Sarah cribbed and stomped her foot, watching her leave, and immediately followed her inside. Philip smiled to himself and trailed behind her. Inside, the kids jumped with happiness, seeing Melissa, and surrounded her from everywhere. It was definitely a sight to watch for Philip, because he could see how much the kids loved, respected, and adored her. Melissa, why did you leave? Please come back to stay with us. One of them pleaded, and the others joined, and she could feel her heart aching at these innocent requests. Melissa, are you angry at us? Did we upset you? We promise we won't irritate you or do any kind of mischief. Those innocent pleading eyes were making it difficult for her to control her tears. But then Sarah came to her rescue. Okay, everyone, what did I tell you when Melissa was gone? Sarah asked, gaining their attention, whereas Philip just stood as a silent spectator. That she has some very important work and will be back very soon. One of them replied, and Sarah smiled. Exactly. And see, even if she has work, she still comes to visit us, doesn't she? Everyone nodded while Melissa smiled at them. We love you, Melissa, they said in a chorus, smiling at her, and then with a force hugged her. She stumbled back, but chuckled and hugged them back. Sarah smiled, folding her hands and staring at them, but unaware someone was doing the same. Philip couldn't decipher what to feel after he witnessed such a scene. He felt overwhelmed seeing the children's love for Melissa, Sarah, understanding Melissa's unspoken turmoil and coming to her rescue. All of this was something which he had only heard but never seen. But today, seeing it and that content smile on everyone's face was exhilarating. He couldn't understand why he could not take his eyes off of Sarah's smiling face or just turn back and leave, because it seemed like his feet were stuck. "Melissa, who is he?" a kid asked. And that is when the focus was on Philip. And for the first time he felt nervous seeing so many eyes on him. Billionaire's Contract. Episode 9. Melissa's POV. Philip smiled nervously at the kids who were giving him suspicious looks, while Sarah just rolled her eyes. What was so interesting in the guy that everyone was staring at him? Melissa smiled in his direction and informed the kids, "He's my friend, Philip." Sarah frowned and a look of displeasure settled on her face. She saw Philip giving her best friend a grateful look and Melissa blinking her eyes in assurance. And she hated every bit of it. Not because she had even a bit of liking towards the guy or didn't like them together, but simply because he was already stealing her best friend, and she would no way share her with anyone. Any which ways he already had his best friend, then why was he keen on befriending Melissa? She was still frowning at Philip way when a tap on her shoulder brought her out of her trance. She looked at Melissa, who was staring at her with her raised eyebrows. Sarah nodded her head and immediately clutched her hand, tightly pulling her closer, confusing Melissa. She then glared at Philip, who wasn't even looking their way, and was busy with the kids. "What's wrong, Sarah? Why do you keep glaring at the poor guy?" Melissa questioned, and Sarah's frown deepened. "Why do you keep siding with him? Are you his best friend? Or mine?" She scowled, looking at her, and Melissa stared at her amused. What had gotten into her? "I hate him," she snapped, just when Melissa opened her mouth to speak, and then left, leaving her surprised. It was around 9 that Melissa returned to the mansion with a smile playing on her lips. She definitely had a good time at her place with her people, and if not entirely, but Philip was getting including in that list. She had realized that Sarah was jealous of Philip because she was getting more comfortable with him, and it made her laugh and love her even more, because such a best friend was only rare. She walked towards her room when a voice called her from behind. She stopped, but did not turn around because she didn't want to spoil her mood. "Were you with Philip?" he asked, staring at her back, and she could feel his eyes on her. She was for once glad that he didn't ask her about where she was. And why was she so late? Because that would have surely made her lose her mind. "Yes," she answered simply and waited for him to speak. "If you don't want to be associated with me or be on the news channel the first thing in the morning, then I suggest you to stop going out with my friend. You can't be this careless." His voice was cold, and instead it riled her up. She turned around to give him a piece of his mind, but he was already gone. Gritting her teeth, she took deep breaths and calmed herself before leaving for her room. Another week passed, and soon they were called by for the pregnancy test. Melissa was nervous and praying for the results to be positive, whereas Sahil sat unaffected. "Mrs. Willingstone," she was called, and the retort was on the tip of her tongue, but she gulped it down. A while later, the tests were done, and they waited inside the doctor's cabin for the results. Melissa kept fidgeting with her hands and kept glancing at the door every now and then. She would glance at Nelson as well, but he was too immersed in his phone. "Hello, Mr. and Mrs. Willingston. Sorry to keep you waiting, but the results are here," he said with a fake smile and looked at Nelson, who was piercing his confidence with his gaze. He took out the papers and read. Then, before masking the disappointment on his face, the doctor looked at Melissa's hopeful face and with a solemn look declared the result. "I'm sorry, but the results are negative. She is not pregnant. We're really sorry, Mrs. Willingstone." Finally, it was done, and the doctor felt relieved just because he was going to get rid of Nelson Willingstone. Melissa went numb for a second as she stared at the doctor, his words ringing in her ears. Negative, negative, negative. She was not pregnant. It felt like a whole bucket of ice was poured over her. She felt her eyes brimming as she bit her lip to stop the sobs. She heard the distant formalities between the doctor and Nelson, but she couldn't focus on anything. She really wanted all this to be dream, and wake up on her bed with the kids laughing and shouting in the background. How had her life taken such a big turn? Was she really this unlucky? "Melissa?" She blinked her eyes to clear her vision and looked up at him. He had no disappointment in his eyes. No pain, no remorse, nothing. They were still blank. What was he? Did he not have emotions? Or was he so cold that he didn't want to show them? Didn't he want a child? Then why was he not sad? In that moment, he truly looked like a monster to her. "Let's go," he announced, and the next second walked out of there without giving her another glance. She followed behind silently, and they left for the mansion. After dropping her, Nelson left for his work and called Philip as well. "Rohit, make sure that the doctor or anyone from that hospital keeps this information confidential. If so much as even a tiny piece of information, like me visiting the hospital, goes out, you're dead," Nelson threatened, and Rohit nodded, sighing to himself. Another one added to the list. Now it was nothing new for him, and even his threats felt usual. The door opened and Philip walked in, and Rohit took his leave. He sat on the chair and leaned back, relaxing. They stared at each other, not saying anything for almost 15 minutes. "You will fall in love with me if you stare at me for another second." Philip snickered, but Nelson didn't stop. "Okay, now it's getting creepy. Tell me, why have you called me here?" Nelson smirked suddenly, and Philip looked suspicious. "What have you done?" he questioned, narrowing his eyes, as Nelson looked every bit of smug. "Played a game." One Nelson replied, not explaining further, and Philip realized he was talking about Melissa. He grew worried, thinking what he must have done, because he knew that his best friend won't even explain it to him, even if asked. "You know, Nelson, I wouldn't have cared about your games had it been anyone else. But this is Melissa, and she is every bit of naive for you to play these games. So stop before you regret every bit of it." There were only few occasions where Philip was serious, and when it would come to his close ones, he could even turn ruthless. "Why? You barely know her, and you're already being protective of her? What's the catch?" Nelson asked, looking uninterested, but Philip could see something in his eyes which was never seen before. "I don't know, but she is unlike other girls out there. She is different, innocent, and I believe she's even unaware of what kind of devil you are. And if you are going to taint her, remember, before anyone else, you won't be able to forgive yourself." It were the words or the warning in Philip's eyes, but Nelson did not like it even a bit. In fact, he hated it. and he knew the reason was Melissa. Just her mere presence was enough to bring a crack in his years of friendship. Melissa sat in her room, lost in her thoughts. There was too much going inside her head, and she didn't know how to stop it. The results came out negative. She was not pregnant, but there was something missing. She felt like she was missing out on something. What? She had no idea, but it was constantly nagging her. Also, now that she couldn't conceive through her method, she knew she will have to abide by his rules. And she wasn't even prepared. Of course, it will be with her consent, but only verbal one. She sighed, suddenly exhausted, and dropped herself on the bed. It was too much for her. Way too much. Just as she was about to close her eyes, her phone rang, irritating her. She made a face and saw Nelson calling her. Without any interest, she picked it up and pressed it on her ear. "Pack your things and get out of my mansion," he said coldly, but she could even sense the rage behind it. She sat up with a jerk, fully awake, and stared at the wall ahead, dumbfounded. "What?" she whispered, and heard nothing, which made her doubt about the previous statement. Maybe she was hearing things now. "I said, get out of my mansion and don't show me your face ever again. The contract is terminated, and I've got nothing to do with you anymore." He gritted out, and her eyes widened. "Stop playing, Mr. Willingston. I don't trust you even a bit. Who knows, you throw me out of the house now and then file a suit against me the next second for breaching the contract. I'm not that stupid, and I'm not leaving." She snapped back and held the phone tightly. "Listen, Melissa, don't test my patience and leave before I come back, or else you'll face the consequences." With that, the line was disconnected, and she was already fuming. What the hell? She very well knew what he meant by consequences, and if anything, she wasn't scared this time, instead ready for it.